The last threads of sunset painted the skies over Maple Hollow in streaks of copper and gold. Evening crept in like a slow tide, and the narrow roads winding through the sleepy countryside stretched into long, ominous shadows. Faint lamplight flickered along the sidewalks, some posts blinking like they were struggling to stay awake. 12-year-old Ivy Monroe hugged a paper bag to her chest, its contents rustling with every nervous step. Her boots, too big and a little worn, scuffed the pavement. A hoodie 3 sizes too large draped over her arms. She kept glancing sideways at Shadow, her tall, jet-black Belgian Malinois, whose steps never drifted far from hers. Ears perked, body tense, he scanned every bush and corner, as if reading a language she couldn't see. Ivy trusted his instincts more than her own. Most kids her age didn't walk home anymore, not after what happened last month to a boy near the creek trail. Her uncle, Deputy Monroe, had warned her to get home before dusk. She'd meant to, but the line at the small-town grocer had dragged on. Now the streets felt hollow. Storefronts had their gates drawn. Curtains in houses were pulled tight. Even the usual hum of TV noise was absent. She passed the old laundry shack, its neon sign barely alive, now just reading a UMT. It buzzed like a hornet in a bottle. The cold pinched her fingertips through the paper bag. Shadow stopped. No sound, no warning. Just a low growl, deep and steady, vibrating through his chest. Ivy froze, heart hammering. His body leaned forward, muscles coiling like a spring. She followed his gaze ahead, beneath the shaky glow of the last working street lamp. Something flickered, something moving. Ivy squinted. Then came the sound that made her blood run cold. The rising growl of engines. The growl turned into a full-throated roar. 4 motorcycles burst from the curve in the road, headlights blazing through the dim. They moved as one, tight, fast, too smooth for a casual cruise. Each rider wore black leather, and across their backs, Ivy saw the same symbol, a white cobra with silver fangs, stitched in a way that shimmered in the light. Shadow growled louder, stepping in front of her like a moving shield. Ivy's stomach turned. Her uncle had warned her about these guys. Not just bikers, the Coil, a gang that had been popping up in every small town around Maple Hollow. No one knew what they wanted, but every time they showed up, something went missing. Or someone. She ducked to the side of the street, hoping, pleading, they'd ride past. They didn't. The bikes stopped in a half-circle around her. Engines cut. Silence. The kind that makes you feel like you're standing in the middle of a frozen lake. Boots hit pavement, one by one. Slow. Deliberate. Ivy could hear her own breath now, sharp and shallow. Shadow didn't move a muscle, eyes locked forward, tail stiff as stone. The man in front was tall and lean, with a chain looped around his belt and a wicked scar slicing across his eyebrow. He took off his helmet and smirked. "Evenin', sweetheart," he said, voice slick and sour. "Grocery run?" "Bit late for that, don't you think?" Another rider laughed, nudging the paper bag with the tip of his boot. Ivy gripped the bag tighter. "I'm going home," she said firmly. The leader's eyes flicked down to Shadow. "Well, look at that. Fancy mutt." Shadow bared his teeth silently. "Easy, boy," the man said mockingly, crouching. "No need to get all brave." But Ivy could feel it in the air. This wasn't a chat. This was a trap. Shadow's body tightened, a silent spring, ready to launch. Ivy didn't need to give a command. His training ran deeper than instinct. She could feel it in his stance, the electric tension building behind his stillness. The broad-shouldered rider to her left laughed and lifted a heavy boot as if to kick. "Bet he folds like a pup," he sneered. Shadow snapped his jaw once. Not a bite, just a warning. The man flinched. Their leader chuckled. Guess not. He straightened and took a step toward Ivy. See, here's the thing, kid. Your uncle's been a real thorn in our side. Arrested 2 of my guys last week. We don't like that. Ivy's heart pounded. So this was personal. She glanced behind her. No exit. The bikes blocked the road, and the houses nearby were either asleep or pretending to be. The closest porch light was dark. The only thing between her and whatever came next was the dog at her side and the bag in her arms. She tightened her grip. "Why don't you hand that over?" the leader said, pointing lazily at the groceries. "And maybe we'll just call it a night." Ivy didn't move. One of the other bikers muttered, "She's stalling." "Or bluffing," said another. The leader raised an eyebrow. "You think this dog's gonna save you?" Shadow growled again, lower, longer. "Let's find out." The man sneered and took one more step. Ivy's voice cracked through the cold. "Shadow. Guard." What happened next happened fast. With a burst of motion, Shadow launched, teeth flashing under the streetlight. He collided with the nearest biker mid-step, jaws clamping down with terrifying control. The man screamed, stumbling back, his arm locked in Shadow's grip. The other bikers shouted, scrambling, but Shadow wasn't done. Shadow pivoted, dragging the man down hard, before releasing and leaping toward a second attacker who had drawn something from his jacket. Maybe a knife, maybe worse. The biker didn't get a chance to find out. The dog crashed into him like a black missile, snarling, snapping, driving him straight into the side of a motorcycle. Metal clanged. The man collapsed in a heap. Ivy stumbled back, stunned by how fast it was happening. Screams, barking, shouting, all blurred together into a storm of chaos. Tires screeched as one of the riders scrambled to get back on his bike. "Back off! Back off!" one of them yelled. "It's a police dog." The leader, scarred and snarling now, pulled something from his belt. A baton? A pipe? He raised it toward Shadow. Ivy didn't think. She lunged. The paper bag burst as she hurled it into the man's chest. Cans clattered everywhere. He cursed, stumbling as he tried to swat them away. It was enough. Shadow turned at her shout and sprang again. The leader dropped his weapon as he tumbled back, arms flailing. One of the bikes fell over. Another revved and peeled away into the night, rider fleeing. "Enough!" shouted the one still standing, backing toward his bike. "Let's go. Leave it." The last biker grabbed the leader by the arm and yanked him upright. "She ain't worth it." They vanished into the darkness with the shriek of tires, leaving behind dented metal and smeared boot prints. Ivy stood frozen. Shadow circled back to her side, sides heaving, muzzle flecked with dirt, but eyes alert and focused. The world finally went quiet again. Then, from down the street, a new light appeared, flashing red and blue, and a voice roared through the silence. "Ivy." She knew that voice, and for the first time all night, she could finally breathe. Deputy Monroe's cruiser screeched to a halt beside the curb, headlights washing over Ivy and Shadow. The driver's door flew open before the engine even quieted. Her uncle stormed out, hand hovering near his holster, eyes scanning the mess. "Ivy!" he shouted again, this time breathless. "I'm okay," she called out, her voice small, shaky. He rushed to her, gripping her shoulders, then turning to Shadow. "You protected her," he murmured, almost in disbelief. "Good boy." Shadow gave a soft, tired grunt and slumped at Ivy's feet. The street behind them began to stir. Porch lights flicked on. A curtain twitched in one of the windows. People had heard the fight, the barking, the engine roars, but no one had come out. Not until now. Another cruiser pulled up, lights flashing, then a third. Soon the quiet street was washed in red and blue. "Let's get you both checked out," Monroe said. "EMS is coming. You hit your head?" "No," Ivy said. "But they knew who you were. They said you arrested their guys. They were going to hurt me." He cursed under his breath, his jaw tightening. "It's the coil. They're escalating." As officers moved in, Ivy sat on the tailgate of her uncle's truck with a blanket around her shoulders. Shadow lay beside her, calm now, but his eyes still followed every unfamiliar movement. A paramedic asked if she was okay. She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. Monroe returned with his radio clipped to his shoulder, voice low but urgent. "They'll patrol the area. We've got descriptions, plates. But the leader, he's called Rafe Voss. He's slippery." Ivy looked up. "He said it wasn't about me. It was about you." Her uncle paused, eyes clouded. Then he said, "Well, they just made it about all of us." And in that moment, Ivy knew. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The morning after the attack dawned gray and quiet. Rain tapped softly on the roof of Deputy Monroe's cabin as Ivy sat curled on the couch, a mug of cocoa between her hands. Across from her, Shadow dozed near the fireplace, legs twitching slightly, perhaps chasing down enemies in his dreams. Her uncle sat nearby, boots still muddy from a night of pacing. He hadn't slept. "You ever wonder how Shadow got so trained?" he asked, voice barely louder than the rain. Ivy looked up. "I thought you trained him." He shook his head. "Not me. Not even close." He rose and walked over to the dog, gently parting the fur behind Shadow's ear. There, almost hidden beneath the black coat, was a tiny tattoo. Numbers. "That's a badge code," Monroe said. "He used to be military K-9, part of a special unit. They lost track of him after a bombing raid overseas. A buddy of mine found him, half-starved, wandering a rail yard, and brought him stateside." Ivy blinked. "And you just kept him?" "I pulled some strings, rehabbed him. Most dogs with that kind of trauma, they get put down." He paused. "But this one still had fire." She leaned down, gently stroking Shadow's head. "He saved my life. And he'll do it again if he has to." Outside, tires crunched on gravel. A cruiser. Monroe stepped to the window, then sighed. Time to give a statement. Ivy stood, cocoa forgotten. "Do I have to?" "Only what you're ready for." But she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. The memory of the circle of motorcycles, the fear, the cold metal smell, none of it had faded. Shadow stirred, sensing the tension. Monroe looked back at her. "It's okay to be scared." Ivy nodded, her voice soft. "I'm not scared." A pause. "I'm mad." Ivy gave her statement in the station's back room, where the wood paneling smelled faintly of coffee and dust. A female officer named Jenna took notes gently, never pushing, just nodding, as Ivy spoke in clipped, quiet sentences. She described the circle of bikers, the silver cobra patch, the scar on the leader's face, the way Shadow didn't wait for a signal. He just knew. Jenna leaned back when Ivy finished. "You were brave," she said. "Most grown adults wouldn't hold it together like that." Ivy didn't respond. Later, her uncle returned to the cabin with a box of security camera printouts and a bag of takeout. He handed her a sandwich, but kept pacing as he flipped through the stills. "3 plates confirmed stolen," he muttered, "but one matches an old case from Pine Ridge. Might be hour in." Ivy didn't ask what hour in meant. She just watched him work, jaw clenched, eyes bloodshot. He wasn't just solving a case. He was chasing ghosts, ones that threatened his niece. That night, the storm rolled in hard. Wind howled through the pine trees, Thunder grumbled like a warning, and then they heard it. The rattling clang of metal. Monroe leapt to his feet, Shadow already at the door. They opened it to find no one, except on the front door, scrawled in dripping red paint, was a single word: payback. Beneath it, a jagged drawing of a cobra. Ivy stared at it, fists clenched. "They came here," she whispered. Monroe scanned the yard with a flashlight. No movement, no sound, but the air felt violated. "We're moving," he said. "Pack a bag." Ivy didn't argue. She went straight to her room and grabbed what mattered: her notebook, a flashlight, her boots, and Shadow's leash. They weren't safe anymore. And Rafe Voss had just made that crystal clear. Rain hammered the windshield as Deputy Monroe's truck barreled down the highway, wipers thrashing in frantic arcs. Ivy sat in the passenger seat, Shadow curled across her feet like a living blanket, ears flicking at every hiss of water under the tires. Behind them, Maple Hollow dwindled into a smear of taillights and pine silhouettes. Yet the crimson word "payback" still burned on Ivy's mind as brightly as any neon sign. Monroe kept one hand on the wheel, the other on the radio. "Unit 12 relocating witnesses," he reported. "Destination: Ridgeline Motor Lodge, room pre-cleared." A crackle of static, then a dispatcher's voice confirmed receipt. He exhaled, tension unspooling, but not disappearing. Ivy could see the white of his knuckles in every passing flash of lightning. The motel clung to the mountainside like a relic, 2 stories of peeling teal paint, its flickering vacancy sign half missing. Monroe parked beneath the overhang, engine idling. "Inside, quick," he said. "I'll unload later." Ivy opened the door. Shadow hopped out first, nose sweeping the damp air before giving a single, low chuff. Clear. They climbed an iron stairwell to room 27, keys jangling like nervous teeth. Inside smelled of pine cleaner and old carpet. Floral curtains flapped in the draft from a rattling window unit. Ivy tossed her duffel onto the bed, then crouched to unclip Shadow's leash. The dog padded a circuit of the room, sniffing corners, checking under both beds, finally parking by the door. Monroe pulled the curtains tight and slid a chair beneath the knob. "2 deputies patrol the lot," he assured, though his voice lacked conviction. He sat on the bed opposite Ivy and ran a hand through rain-slick hair. "Tomorrow we meet someone who can help. A county investigator named Riley Crane. She's been tracking the coil for months." Ivy hugged her knees. "Will he come here tonight?" Monroe looked at Shadow, then at Ivy. "If Voss tries, he'll find we're not alone." Thunder boomed overhead, and Shadow's ears twitched. But he didn't move. He was waiting, guarding, until dawn. Morning came with dull gray skies, and the smell of motel coffee wafting through the thin walls. Ivy sat cross-legged on the floral bedspread, watching Shadow's chest rise and fall. He had finally relaxed, but never fully slept. Every creak outside made his ears twitch. Ivy was starting to feel the same. A knock at the door jolted both of them. Monroe opened it just a crack, his badge hand held low. A woman stood outside, raincoat still dripping, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Deputy Monroe?" she asked. He stepped back. "Detective Crane?" She nodded. "Riley Crane, task force lead on the Voss operation. May I come in?" Ivy watched from the bed as Monroe gestured her inside. Shadow stood protectively between them, tail still, eyes locked. Crane paused and crouched slightly, letting him sniff her knuckles. "Military training," she murmured. "Malinois, right? Smart choice." Monroe gave a tight smile. "He chose us." Crane settled into the desk chair and opened her satchel, pulling out a folder. "What happened to Ivy matches what we've seen in 4 other towns. Voss and his crew aren't just petty bikers. They're organized, calculated, and lately, they've been targeting law enforcement families. Ivy's chest tightened. Because of my uncle. Crane met her eyes. Because your uncle made noise they don't want. Arrests, seizures. He's a symbol of everything they hate. She slid a photo across the table. Rafe Voss, scar across his eyebrow, smirking in a mugshot. He's moving product now, guns, maybe even trafficked parts. We think there's a deal going down in 2 nights at an old warehouse outside Bramble Creek. We need eyes on it. Monroe's jaw tightened. You're asking me to bait him. Crane's voice dropped. I'm asking you to end this. Shadow growled softly. No one argued with him. Deputy Monroe stood at the motel room window, arms crossed as the rain returned in a soft drizzle. Behind him, Detective Crane unfurled a map on the table, pressing it flat with a worn thermos. Ivy watched from the edge of the bed, her eyes flicking between the 2 adults as if reading a foreign language. This, Crane said, pointing to a red-circled dot, is the old Bramble Creek Mill. Abandoned a decade ago, but the structure's solid, enough to house a small armory. Our intel says Voss is meeting a supplier there. Cash for weapons, no exact time, just after dark. Monroe nodded. You want me nearby? I want you visible, she replied. Just enough for him to believe he's still being watched. So he slips. So he gets sloppy. Ivy clenched her fists. What if he doesn't get sloppy? Crane looked at her. Then we follow his trail until he runs out of road. Monroe moved to the map, tapping another point. There's a service road here. If we station quietly along the ridge, we can trap them in the clearing. Crane's lips twitched in a half-smile. You're not bad at this. I wasn't always desk-bound. Shadow shifted from his post at the door, padding over to Ivy. She scratched behind his ears without looking, her gaze still locked on the map. I want to help, she said suddenly. Monroe turned. Ivy? I'm not talking about sneaking into some warehouse, she said. But I remember what they looked like, how they moved. The tattoo on one guy's wrist. I remember it all. Crane leaned forward. You've got a memory like a camera, don't you? I draw, Ivy said. I can sketch every one of them. Crane gave a slow nod. That could be useful. Monroe looked between them, torn between pride and dread. But in his eyes, Ivy saw something else. He finally saw her, not as the girl he needed to protect, but the ally he couldn't afford to lose. The motel room turned into an improvised war room. Crane cleared the small table while Ivy pulled her sketchpad from her backpack. She flipped past pages of wolves, fire towers, and dragons until she found a blank sheet. Shadow lay under the table, head on his paws, watching her pencil move with quiet intent. They didn't wear full helmets, Ivy murmured. 3 of them had visors up, 1 wore goggles. But I remember their eyes. She started with the scarred leader, Rafe Voss. The curve of the scar above his brow. The way his jaw stayed tilted, like he always had a retort ready. Next came the heavy-set biker with a flame tattoo on his neck. Then the one with jagged earrings and a smirk like a shark. Crane leaned over her shoulder. You've got talent. That's not just memory. It's detail. I never forget faces, Ivy said, not quite smiling. Even when I want to. Monroe looked up from his notes. We'll feed these sketches through facial recognition, and I'll call in a favor from dispatch. We might get lucky. But luck wasn't something Ivy believed in anymore. By nightfall, 3 sketches had been scanned and emailed to the state task force. Crane stepped outside to take a secure call, leaving Monroe and Ivy alone in the room. You know, he said quietly, you could have panicked that night. No one would have blamed you. Ivy kept her eyes on the sketch pad. I didn't have time. He sat beside her. What you did was brave, but brave doesn't mean unafraid. It means doing it anyway. I know, she said. Shadow taught me that. As if hearing his name, the dog let out a soft huff. Crane stepped back in, her expression unreadable. We've got a partial ID on one of them. He's tied to a weapons raid outside Pine Ridge last spring. She paused, then added, and he's already on parole. Detective Crane dropped the folder on the table, the manila edges damp from mist. His name's Derek Halsey, goes by Blister. Served time for illegal weapons transport. Picked up in a sting 2 towns over. He's not supposed to be within 50 miles of Bramble Creek. Monroe frowned. Why isn't he still behind bars? Technicalities, she muttered. Bad paperwork, weak witness, usual garbage. Ivy looked at the sketch she'd drawn of him. That's him. He was the one that kicked at Shadow. Crane nodded. Then we've got motive, presence, and violation of parole. It's not enough to bring Voss in, but it's a thread, and threads lead to rope. Monroe turned to his niece. You sure about the ID? Positive. He glanced at Crane. We take this to Judge Mathers. She'll issue a conditional warrant. She already did, Crane replied. I sent the file 10 minutes ago. She faxed back an hour later. She pulled out the stamped sheet and laid it on the table like a winning card. We're clear to search the mill perimeter with cause. If we spot Blister or any of the gang, we're greenlit to detain and question. Ivy let out a shaky breath. So, what now? Monroe leaned forward, elbows on knees. Now we prepare. Crane began outlining their approach. 2 teams, one undercover at a logging road near the creek, the other on drone surveillance from the ridgeline. Monroe would go in civilian clothes, posing as a curious hiker. Ivy and Shadow would remain at the motel with Officer Tenor on watch. I don't like leaving her, Monroe admitted. Crane gave a sharp glance. If anything happens to Ivy, Voss wins. Shadow raised his head, ears sharp. Ivy reached down, resting her hand between his shoulders. He's not getting near me, she said firmly. Shadow didn't blink. Neither did she. By the next afternoon, the air over Bramble Creek thickened with tension. Mist curled between the trees like silent watchers, and the ground was damp from a night of scattered rain. Ivy watched from the motel room window as Officer Tenor adjusted his radio outside. His cruiser was parked diagonally across the lot, engine humming low. Inside, Shadow paced the carpet like a soldier on duty. Monroe had left hours earlier with Crane and 2 deputies, hiking gear slung over his shoulder, to play the role of weekend adventurer. Ivy had wanted to go, had argued, but Monroe was firm. You're safe here, he'd said, and you're helping just by staying smart. Still, waiting felt worse than danger. Ivy picked up her sketchpad again, not to draw, but to write. She flipped to a blank page and began listing everything she remembered from the night of the attack. The timing, the brands of the bikes, the way one of the men limped slightly, even the scent of the motor oil on his gloves, small things that no camera would catch. Shadow perked up suddenly, moving to the door with a low chuff. Ivy followed, heart thumping, but it was only Tenor checking in. He waved from outside the window, then pointed to his wrist. Check-in time. Back at Bramble Creek, Monroe crouched behind a moss-covered stone wall near the edge of the clearing. Through binoculars, he saw movement. 3 bikes already there, a 4th approaching. One of them matched Blister's description. Voss hadn't shown yet. Crane's voice crackled in his earpiece. 10 minutes to go time. Stand by. Monroe clicked his mic. Visual confirmed. They're unloading crates. At the motel, Ivy closed her notebook. Something in her chest twisted. She didn't know why, but something about today felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. And Shadow seemed to sense it too. The old Bramble Creek mill stood like a skeleton in the fog. Rusted beams, shattered windows, a broken silo leaning to one side like a drunk. From his perch on the ridge, Monroe watched 4 men move through the clearing with military precision. One carried a duffel, another held a clipboard. Blister was among them, his flame neck tattoo exposed as he wiped sweat from his brow. Crane's voice crackled again. "Confirmed 4th biker is Halsey. 5th vehicle inbound. Time to tighten the noose." Down below, a black SUV rolled in, its headlights off despite the fading light. Out stepped Rafe Voss, unmistakable, tall, scarred, his expression unreadable. He barked an order, and 2 men began hauling crates from the back of the truck. Inside one crate, rifles. Another, armor vests. "Get ready," Crane whispered. "We take them when the handoff happens." Monroe nodded, already moving into position near a collapsed tool shed. His heart thudded, not just from nerves, but from memory. He'd seen this kind of deal before. It never ended clean. At the motel, Ivy couldn't sit still. Shadow stood by the door, stiff, alert. Then, he growled, low, deep. She turned to the window, expecting to see Tenor, but his cruiser was gone. Her pulse quickened. She moved to the door and cracked it open. "Officer Tenor?" Silence. A noise behind her, scraping. She spun. The back window above the bathroom was open an inch. She hadn't opened it. Shadow barked sharply, lunging at the door. Ivy slammed it shut again, heart pounding. Back at the mill, Crane gave the call. "Go!" Floodlights exploded. Officers swarmed the clearing. Shouts, weapons drawn, chaos erupting. Voss didn't run. He laughed, raising his hands slowly. But Monroe saw it in his eyes. This wasn't surprise. It was bait. And somewhere, miles away, Ivy was suddenly alone. Ivy backed away from the door. Shadow pressed tight against her legs, teeth bared. Her breaths came in short, shaky bursts. She grabbed Monroe's backup phone from the drawer. No signal. Of course. The motel sat in a dead zone. Someone was out there. She tiptoed toward the back of the room, pushing a chair against the door, then yanked open the closet and shoved her sketchpad, flashlight, and Shadow's leash into her backpack. Just in case. Then she froze. Footsteps, just outside. Slow, deliberate. Shadow's hackles rose. He was silent now, deadly calm. Ivy crouched beside him. From outside, a voice. "Come on out, girl. You don't want to make this messy." She knew that voice. Blister. At Bramble Creek, Monroe's radio crackled. "Perimeter clear. Suspects detained. Voss is in custody." But Crane wasn't smiling. "He gave up too easy," she murmured. "Something's off." Monroe's stomach dropped. "Ivy." He turned, sprinting from the clearing, shouting over the comm. "I need a unit to Ridgeline Motel now." Ivy might be compromised. Back at the motel, the door rattled violently. Ivy ducked into the bathroom, slamming it shut and locking it. The only escape was the tiny window. She looked at Shadow. "Go," she whispered. "If I open it, you go first. Got it?" He didn't move, just stared at her, unwavering. The door exploded inward with a crash, splinters flying. Ivy yanked open the window. Cold air rushed in. She lifted Shadow through. He wriggled out onto the fire escape landing. Then she turned to climb up after him, and froze. Blister stood in the doorway, grinning. "Found you." But before he could take another step, a flash of black fur, a growl like thunder. And Shadow launched straight back through the window. Shadow hit Blister like a battering ram. The man staggered back, arms flailing as the dog clamped onto his forearm with a bone-crunching snap. He screamed, falling sideways into the dresser. Ivy scrambled through the window after them, adrenaline drowning out her fear. "Shadow, heel!" she shouted. The dog released on command, stepping back with a snarl still rumbling in his throat. Blister groaned, clutching his bleeding arm. Ivy didn't wait. She grabbed the backpack, kicked the motel room door wide open, and ran. Shadow stayed glued to her side as they sprinted down the corridor. Behind them, Blister's voice rasped, "You little—" But another voice cut in from the parking lot. "Freeze! Drop the weapon!" Flashing lights. Sirens. Monroe's truck screeched to a stop, and he leapt from the driver's seat, with his service weapon drawn. 2 deputies poured out behind him. Blister burst into view from the hallway, but stopped cold at the sight of half a dozen weapons, aimed squarely at his chest. He dropped the blade he was carrying. Monroe rushed to Ivy, dropping to his knees. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," she gasped. "Shadow saved me again." Shadow stood between them and Blister, hackles still raised. Crane arrived moments later, eyes sharp, voice level. "We've got Voss. His little ambush here was supposed to be the distraction, while he tied up loose ends." Monroe looked at Blister, meaning her. Blister just glared, blood dripping down his sleeve. Crane leaned close. "You picked the wrong kid, pal. She's not bait. She's the reason we're going to bury your operation." Ivy stood straighter at those words. For the first time since this all began, she didn't feel like someone being protected. She felt like a piece of the fight. And this time, they were winning. Back at the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but Ivy didn't flinch. She sat across from a long conference table, flanked by Monroe and Detective Crane. A recorder blinked red at the center. "We're ready when you are," said Crane gently. Ivy opened her notebook. Not her sketchpad this time. This one was filled with lists, diagrams, observations. Things she'd noticed from the night of the attack, the motel intrusion, even Voss's voice on a garbled radio clip Crane had played for her. She read them out, one by one. Her voice was steady. Blister used his left hand. That means his gun would be holstered on the right. But during the motel break-in, he pulled it from the left. So it wasn't his. Crane nodded, impressed. Stolen weapon, then. Monroe looked at his niece with something between awe and pride. What else? He said loose ends. That means Voss knew I survived. He knew exactly where we were staying. Someone fed him that. Crane stiffened. Internal leak. They continued for an hour, identifying faces from surveillance stills, recalling exact times. Ivy's memory was precise, methodical, like she'd been preparing her whole life for this. When it ended, Crane turned off the recorder. "You just gave us more than 6 officers did in a week," she said. "You should be proud." Ivy looked down at her hands. "I'm not trying to be brave. I'm just tired of being scared." Monroe squeezed her shoulder. "That's what makes you brave, kiddo." Later that night, Monroe and Ivy stood outside under the stars, shadow curled beside them. The station was quiet. The town was still. "You think it's over?" she asked. Monroe took a breath. "Not yet, but Voss is in custody, and with your help, we're closer than ever." Ivy looked at Shadow, then at the stars, then forward. Always forward. 2 days passed. Voss sat in county lockup, smirking through every interrogation. He refused a lawyer, refused a phone call, said nothing, until Detective Crane brought in Ivy's sketches. He leaned back in the plastic chair and chuckled. "That little artist still alive?" Crane didn't react. "She's the reason you're here. You and your men underestimated the wrong kid." He tapped the drawings with a dirty fingernail. "You think catching me shuts it down? I'm just the echo, not the thunder." Crane narrowed her eyes. Then who is? But Voss just grinned. Back at the station, Ivy was in the records room. She sat cross-legged on the floor, files stacked around her like a paper fortress. Monroe had reluctantly agreed to let her help, under supervision. She wasn't digging for trauma anymore. She was looking for patterns. "This guy," she said, pointing to a report from 6 months ago. "Same flame tattoo, same bike model, same route." The officer beside her nodded. He wasn't listed under Blister's name. Because it wasn't him. It was his cousin. They switch IDs. Makes it harder to track. She reached for a folder labeled Confiscated Evidence, Bramble Creek Raid, and flipped through photos of the crates. Then her face paled. Inside one crate, next to the rifles and ammo, was a notebook. Labeled in blocky handwriting, Primary Targets, Phase 2. She grabbed it and raced to Crane's office. This wasn't just a weapons deal. It was the next wave. Crane flipped through the pages. Names, locations, photos of patrol routes, even a drawing of Monroe's cabin. "He was planning a coordinated hit," she whispered, "and we stopped it just in time." Ivy sat down, heart pounding. Shadow leaned against her leg. The coil wasn't gone. But now, they weren't hidden either. And Ivy was no longer a bystander. She was the one drawing them out. Crane spread the notebook pages across her desk. Maps, notes, security codes, and something Ivy spotted right away. Coordinates. "Those are real locations," she said, tracing her finger along one map. "And this one. That's Monroe's cabin." Monroe, standing behind her, went still. "How long's that been in there?" "Long enough," Crane muttered. This wasn't just recon. They were planning to hit specific law enforcement officers. Retaliation for the Pine Ridge seizure. "Monroe, you were marked." He exhaled slowly. "Makes sense now. The weird tire tracks last week. I thought it was a hunter." Crane leaned over the table. "We can't risk it. We need to check that cabin. Tonight." "I'm coming," Ivy said. Monroe shook his head instantly. "Absolutely not." But Crane held up a hand. "She knows the symbols, the layout. She spotted the pattern before any of us. If something's stashed there, we'll need her eyes." Monroe hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "She doesn't leave my side." That evening, they drove up the winding trail toward the ridge, the sun bleeding orange behind the trees. The cabin stood in its usual silence, untouched, but no longer innocent. Shadow jumped from the truck first, nose to the ground. He sniffed along the porch, then stopped at the firewood stack. Growled. Monroe pulled his weapon, motioning Crane to the right. Ivy stayed close, watching as they moved aside the woodpile. Beneath it, disturbed dirt. A plastic tarp. Inside the tarp, a field radio, a burner phone, and a detonator, wrapped and ready. Crane swore under her breath. He wasn't planning to run. He was planning to ignite. Monroe turned pale. "He set up my cabin as the launch point." Ivy whispered, "He wanted you blamed." When it all went off. And that's when Monroe realized. This had never just been about a gang. This was a war. The evidence from the cabin was rushed back to the station under full escort. Crane contacted Homeland Security. Within hours, federal analysts were reviewing the detonator's make. Military grade. "This isn't just a biker gang anymore," she said. "This is paramilitary, sleeper cells, and the coil's bigger than we thought." Ivy stood near the conference room door listening. Monroe's face was grim. "They were going to pin it on me," he muttered. "Local officer goes rogue, wipes out half the task force. Clean, devastating, believable." Crane nodded. "And if Ivy hadn't found that notebook, we'd have walked right into it." Shadow sat by Ivy's feet, eyes tracking every movement in the room. He was never more than a few feet from her now. A tech ran in. We decrypted the burner phone. One text thread, no names. But the last message sent from that phone said, "The girl's still breathing. We failed." Crane turned to Ivy. They weren't just retaliating. You were the priority. Ivy's hands curled into fists. Why me? Monroe stepped closer. Because you saw their faces, and because you didn't run. She looked at the wall of sketches, each one hers, labeled, dated, some now crossed out with red pen, captured, deceased, in custody. I want to finish this, Ivy said. Crane studied her. You will. That night, Ivy lay awake in a cot at the safe house. The wind tapped against the boarded windows. Shadow lay curled at the door. Her phone buzzed, an encrypted message from Crane. We've identified a new site, underground storage beneath the burned factory in Pike Hollow. Could be where they're regrouping. We move tomorrow. We need your eyes. Ivy looked at Shadow. We're not done yet. He blinked once, slow and sure. Neither of them was afraid anymore. The entrance to the old Pike Hollow factory was nearly buried beneath vines and rusted scaffolding. Once a textile mill, it had burned down a decade ago. Now, it was nothing more than a blackened husk. Except, according to Crane's tip, not everything had burned. Ivy adjusted her helmet as Monroe checked her earpiece. Stay behind me. No detours. This is recon only, until we say otherwise. She nodded. Shadow, in his Kevlar vest, trotted silently beside her. The team, 4 officers, Monroe, Crane, and Ivy, moved through the factory's skeletal remains. Inside, beneath a collapsed stairwell, they found it. A steel hatch covered in soot and padlocked with a digital keypad. Crane knelt beside it. This is recent. Keypad's clean. She connected a portable decryptor. The screen blinked for 30 seconds, then the lock clicked. The hatch creaked open with a metallic groan. Stale, hot air rushed up. Monroe glanced at Ivy. You sure you want to do this? I've come this far. They descended. Beneath the factory was a tunnel, long, concrete-lined, lit only by strips of emergency red lighting. The walls were marked with chalk symbols, the same ones Ivy had drawn from memory. Coil territory, she whispered. At the end of the corridor, they found a door. Crane gestured for silence. She pushed it open slowly. Inside, a command post, maps, radios, a large table with blueprints of Bramble County, a laptop still powered on, and a wall covered in photos, surveillance images, officers, informants, and Ivy, her school photo, her motel check-in, her walking shadow. Monroe swore under his breath. Crane stepped back. They weren't just targeting law enforcement. They were building a hit list, Ivy said. She stared at her own photo, thumbtacked above a red string connecting it to Monroe. Target, bait, witness, no more. Now, she was the hunter. Crane began snapping photos of the evidence board while Monroe rifled through file cabinets bolted to the floor. Ivy moved carefully, scanning every inch of the underground room. Her eyes landed on a locked metal drawer beneath the table. Got something. Crane joined her, prying it open with a crowbar. Inside, a slim folder labeled Initiate Tier, handwritten in all caps. Monroe pulled it out and flipped through the pages. It's a recruitment roster. Dozens of names, ages. Most were under 25. Crane squinted at the top page. They're training teenagers. Small-town kids, Ivy added, scanning the names. From Ridgeline, Milltown, even Bramble Creek High. She paused on one name. That's a kid from my chemistry class. Monroe's jaw tensed. They're building a pipeline. From disillusioned kids to trained operatives. Crane snapped the folder shut. We take this to federal intel. If they're this deep in schools, this goes beyond county. Suddenly, a thud. Shadow spun toward the tunnel. Footsteps, multiple. Monroe whispered, "They're coming back." Crane grabbed the laptop and folder. Ivy took the map, and the team backed toward the hatch entrance. But the steel stairs groaned beneath them. Someone was above. Trapped. "We go through the side exit," Crane said, pointing to a secondary shaft Ivy hadn't noticed before. Narrow, dark, steep. One by one, they slid down into the shaft as flashlights flickered from the main tunnel. Voices barked orders. The coil's reinforcements had arrived. Ivy clutched the folder to her chest, sliding down after Monroe. Shadow followed, nimble and silent. They emerged in an old storm drain, ankle deep in runoff. Ivy gasped at the cold, but they kept running. Above them, muffled shouting, but no one followed. Not yet. Once outside, Crane radioed HQ. "Evidence secure. We have the roster and a list of potential recruits." Monroe looked at Ivy. "You just exposed their next generation." Ivy nodded, still breathless. "Then let's shut it down, before it ever begins." Back at headquarters, the tension was razor sharp. The federal agents set up a mobile command center in the parking lot, and Ivy's sketch wall had been digitized and placed on multiple monitors. Names, symbols, timelines. The recruitment list had over 60 names, but one detail wouldn't stop bothering Ivy. A name, Officer Brent Keller, was circled in the folder's margin. Not a recruit. A liaison. "He's one of ours," Crane said, frowning. "Assigned to Ridgeline High as student outreach." Ivy's stomach turned. He gave them access to the school. Monroe's eyes narrowed. "And to me." They brought Keller in under the guise of routine questioning. He sat calmly in the interview room, badge on his belt, sipping station coffee, until Ivy walked in. His face shifted, just a flicker. She placed the recruitment folder on the table. "You recognize this?" He leaned back, lips tight. "Looks like gang junk. What's your point?" She opened to the marked page. "You're here, right next to a minor who disappeared last fall." Sarah Givens Crane entered behind her, silent. Keller's jaw twitched. "You've been leaking information," Monroe said, stepping in. "You warned them about raids. You sent them photos of Ivy." "No proof," Keller snapped. Crane dropped a flash drive on the table. "We traced the motel leak to your department email. Encrypted but sloppy. You underestimated our techs." Keller stood, knocking the chair over. But before he could bolt, Monroe tackled him to the ground, cuffs snapping around his wrists. "Guess you're not as smart as you thought," Monroe muttered. Ivy stood still, heart pounding. He'd been at her school. He'd helped with fundraisers, smiled in photos. And all the while, he was working for them. "Why?" she asked quietly. Keller spat on the floor. "Because they believe in something, not like this broken system." Crane shook her head. "Number, they believe in control." And now, they were losing it. Keller's arrest shattered the coil's grip inside the department. Crane wasted no time. "We cut their last thread. Now we bring down the web." With Keller's encrypted device, they discovered a private communication relay, masked behind a hunting lodge just outside county lines. It was listed as Relay Point Echo. "Satellite dishes, backup servers, and a booster tower," Crane read. "It's how they've been coordinating across state lines." "And uploading everything," Ivy added. "Every name, every plan." They rolled in under cover of night. Crane, Monroe, Ivy, and a federal SWAT unit. The lodge sat nestled in pine trees, deceptively quiet. Too quiet. Inside, they found rows of tech, active, humming. "Clear," a SWAT agent called. Crane stepped in, eyes scanning. "Start downloading everything. Take the servers. Wipe the rest." Monroe watched Ivy move toward a desk covered in printed satellite photos. Her fingers trembled as she picked up an image. Her middle school. Another. Crane's home. Another. Monroe's old apartment. They weren't planning a war, she said. They were planning a purge. Shadow barked suddenly, alert. Ivy turned just in time to see a shadow slip behind the lodge's far wall. "Contact!" an agent shouted. Gunfire erupted outside. Flashbangs. Orders screamed. Ivy ducked under a table as Crane tackled her down. Monroe and SWAT rushed the perimeter. A pickup truck peeled away through the trees, taillights bouncing over roots and gravel. Crane snarled. They tried to torch the place. Ivy looked toward the back, smoke curling from an ignited flare near the battery bank. Without thinking, she grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprinted. Shadow followed. The blast didn't come. They stopped the fire just in time. Crane exhaled, brushing ash from her jacket. Thanks to her. The last signal was now severed, data secured. The coil couldn't call for help anymore, and Ivy had silenced their voice. Back at the safe house, Ivy sat cross-legged on the floor. Pages of satellite images, maps, and marked blueprints spread around her like a battlefield. A coil symbol had appeared on every site they'd hit, spray-painted, etched, or scrawled in chalk. Except one. "There's always a mark," she muttered. A signal. She held up a blurry photo from the relay lodge. On a support beam, partially burned, was a faint outline. Ivy zoomed in digitally. It wasn't the usual circular symbol. It was inverted. A broken coil, sliced through the middle. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Shadow nuzzled beside her. She dug through the old notebook again. Phase 2, scrawled across the top, and flipped to the last page. There it was again. Same mark. Different position. This one had coordinates next to it. She stared. Those weren't the ridgeline coordinates. They were far deeper. Into the forest. Past any place they'd searched. She burst into Crane's office, out of breath. "They're not done. There's one more site." Crane blinked. "Show me." Ivy dropped the map. "They changed the mark to throw us off, but it's still them. The coil is hiding in the old ranger station, off-grid, up in the Bluff Woods." Monroe looked at the faded coordinates. "That station's been abandoned since the wildfire. No roads, no comms." "Exactly," Ivy said. "They think no one would look." Crane stood. "Then that's where we go." Ivy looked at them both. "I'm going too." Crane hesitated, but Monroe just nodded. "We finish it. Together." That night, they loaded up. Final location. No backup. Only what they could carry. As the truck rumbled up the forest road, Ivy held the notebook close. She could feel it. This was the heart. And hearts, when exposed, always beat their last. The truck crawled along the uneven trail, headlights cutting through the dense fog that blanketed Bluff Woods. Trees towered on both sides like sentinels, their branches whispering in the night wind. Ivy sat in the back seat, her hands gripping the old notebook like it might vanish. Shadow sat alert at her feet, ears twitching at every sound. Monroe drove in silence. Crane loaded her rifle. No one spoke, not because they were afraid, but because they knew. This was the end. They parked near a collapsed fire tower. The rest of the way would be on foot. Monroe clicked off the engine. "No cell. No radio. We move fast, no hesitation." Ivy nodded. They hiked up the rocky slope using infrared goggles to pierce the dark. Shadow led, nose to the ground. After 30 minutes of silent climbing, they saw it. The ranger station. It stood crooked but intact, hidden by trees. Solar panels on the roof still functioned. A faint orange glow came from within. Crane whispered, "Movement. Second floor." They split. Monroe and Crane flanked left. Ivy crept forward, shadow tight beside her. Through a cracked window, she saw a figure hunched over a table, studying a map. Another stood nearby, armed. She pulled out her sketchbook and flipped to a face. Riggs, one of Voss's top enforcers, still active, still dangerous. She drew the broken coil symbol with her finger in the dirt. "They're rebuilding from here," she whispered. A creak behind her. She turned. A man stood just 10 feet away, holding a flashlight and a gun. But before he could shout, Shadow lunged. The man fell with a thud. Wind knocked out. Ivy backed up. "Monroe! Crane! We're made!" Lights flared inside the station. Voices yelled. The final battle had begun. Gunfire tore through the silence. Crane dove behind a fallen log, returning fire with precision. Monroe swept wide, flanking the building as figures spilled from the back door. 4, maybe 5, all armed, all trained. "Riggs is inside," Ivy shouted, crouched low beside Shadow. "He's the last piece," Monroe radioed. "Hold the perimeter." No one escapes. Inside, shadows darted behind windows. Ivy knew she couldn't stay outside. The notebooks, the data, the proof, they'd burn it all if they could. She sprinted for the side door, kicking it open with a crash. Smoke stung her eyes. Someone fired, missed. She ducked into a storage room, old ranger uniforms, camping gear, and a desk stacked with files. She grabbed everything she could carry. A voice echoed from upstairs. "She's here." Riggs. Heavy boots stomped above. Ivy backed toward the stairwell as Monroe burst through the front, covering her retreat. Crane followed, tossing a flashbang up the stairs. It exploded with a crack. Silence. They climbed, rifles raised. The upstairs hallway was lined with bunk rooms. Ivy kicked one open, empty. Then another. Third door, locked. "Riggs," Monroe growled. "You're done." No answer. He kicked the door. It didn't budge. "Help me," he said, bracing. He and Crane hit it together. It burst inward. Riggs stood calmly, arms raised, a detonator in one hand. "Go ahead," he said. "You kill me. The place goes up. Everyone dies. That's the price." Ivy stepped forward. "You won't do it. You want to be remembered, not erased." Riggs looked at her, surprised. Crane moved fast. One shot, right to the shoulder. The detonator dropped. Monroe kicked it away. Riggs fell, gasping. They had him. The heart of the coil was beating its last. And Ivy? She stood at its center. Alive, unbroken. Sunrise painted bluff woods in orange and ash gray. The station was secured. Riggs, wounded but alive, had been airlifted out under heavy guard. The coil's final stronghold was being cataloged. Laptops, files, maps, explosives. Evidence of a nearly successful war on their own soil. Ivy sat outside on the ranger station's front steps, her hands stained with soot and ink. Shadow rested against her leg, finally relaxed. Monroe exited the cabin and handed her a thermos. "Black coffee. Probably the worst you've ever had." She smiled faintly. "I'll take it." Crane joined them, holding a thick manila envelope. "We're still identifying half the names. Some kids, some officers, one federal asset." Ivy's eyes darkened. "They were in deeper than we ever guessed." "They used fear," Crane said. "But you used truth. You brought them into the light." She handed Ivy the envelope. Inside, photos. Her sketches now cleaned up, annotated, and turned into official federal profiles. "You did this," Monroe added. "Without you, this doesn't end here." Ivy flipped to the last page. Her own photo. The word, "civilian agent," cleared, stamped across the bottom. She blinked. "I'm not a cop." Crane smirked. "Number, you're better." A helicopter thumped overhead, carrying away confiscated crates. Ivy looked up, wind whipping her hair. It was over. Mostly. Because scattered across the forest, across counties, maybe even states, were more like Riggs, and Ivy knew it. "This won't be the last time," she whispered. "No," Monroe said, "but next time, we'll be ready." Shadow barked softly, as if agreeing. Ivy stood, brushing off her jeans. The woods around them were quiet again. But she had changed. She wasn't just the girl with the sketches anymore. She was the girl who dismantled a war. And that was only the beginning. Bramble Creek looked almost untouched. The same rusted gas station, the diner with the flickering neon sign, kids on bikes, unaware how close their town had come to disaster. Ivy stepped out of the black SUV and stood on the sidewalk outside her old art supply store. Shadow leapt out behind her, tail wagging but cautious. The town felt different, even though it hadn't changed. She wasn't the same girl who had walked this street with headphones in and her head down. Now, people stopped to greet her. The waitress from the diner waved. "Glad you're safe, sweetheart." A high school teacher nodded solemnly. "Thank you for everything." She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and kept walking. Inside the art store, everything smelled like paper and ink. Ivy ran her fingers along the sketch pads, the colored pencils. She bought nothing, just stood quietly. Outside, Crane waited in the car. "You ready?" "I don't know," Ivy said. "What if I'm not meant to go back to normal?" Monroe, riding shotgun, turned around. "Then don't." He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a formal letter. "Ms. Ivy Cole, the Department of Justice would like to offer you a civilian analyst trainee position with the Bureau's Domestic Intelligence Task Force." She stared at it. "You've earned it," Crane said. Ivy looked around, her town, her past, then to the road ahead, and smiled. "I'll need a new sketchbook," Shadow barked. The SUV pulled away from Bramble Creek. This time, Ivy wasn't running. She was choosing. A quiet girl with a pencil had uncovered a conspiracy, taken down a terror cell, and helped rebuild a broken system. Now, she'd do it again. On purpose. 3 months later. Ivy sat at her new desk inside a federal field office in D.C. White walls, steel filing cabinets, a fresh pot of burnt coffee in the corner. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't warm. But it was hers. A fresh sketchbook lay open, already filled with faces, patterns, and coded diagrams. Her role as civilian analyst trainee was unofficial in name only. Every day, agents brought her files, symbols, strange messages, asking, "What do you see?" And more often than not, she saw what they didn't. Shadow now wore an official badge on his harness. Technically, he wasn't allowed inside the office. No one stopped him. One afternoon, Monroe visited. He dropped a new folder on her desk. Small town, unmarked cargo deliveries, 3 unexplained disappearances. Ivy opened it. Her eyes narrowed. On the back of a receipt, just a smudge of ink, but it twisted like a spiral, a coil. She didn't say anything, just turned the book sideways and began sketching. Monroe smiled. Still got it. As he left, Ivy sat back in her chair and looked out the window. D.C. was nothing like Bramble Creek. No woods, no quiet. But it didn't need to be. The truth wasn't in the silence anymore. It was in the details, in her work, in why she kept going. Outside, the city moved on. Cars, crowds, chaos. People lived unaware that darkness had once nearly swallowed them. And Ivy? She was the reason it hadn't. She tore a page from her sketchbook, folded it, and slipped it into her desk drawer. It was a drawing of herself, back when it began. Hoodie, sketchpad, scared. Below it, she'd written, "This is who I was, not who I am." She closed the drawer and opened the next file. Even after joining the task force, Ivy couldn't shake the habit, sketching in silence. Her apartment in D.C. was small but clean, with a view of the Potomac and stacks of filled notebooks lining the shelves. Every night she drew, not just faces of suspects, but fragments of memories, a reflection of what she'd seen, what she'd feared, and what still haunted her. One page she kept returning to was Riggs, his expression before the shot, the look in his eyes, not anger, not pride. Hollow silence. What makes someone choose that path? She asked Crane during a late-night debrief. Crane sighed. Same thing that makes others choose ours. Pain, belief, desperation. Some people just turn the wrong way when they hit the edge. Ivy didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her sketches had already said more than words ever could. One day, she got an internal memo, an encrypted file, labeled Non-Public Recovery Interviews. It was Riggs, speaking from a maximum security facility. They think locking me up ends it, but we were never one group. We were an idea. You can't kill ideas. Ivy paused the video. She rewound it, zoomed in. On the corner of Riggs' orange jumpsuit, a small spiral, inked faintly onto the sleeve. She reported it instantly. The response was swift. Agents swept the facility, 3 guards reassigned, 1 inmate transferred without explanation. But Ivy knew. The idea lived on. That night she started a new sketchbook. On the first page, a blank spiral, only half complete. Shadow barked once, curling at her feet. She smiled. Then let's finish it before they do. Weeks passed. Ivy's daily work revolved around patterns. Digital trails, phone pings, strange purchase orders. She'd grown used to the rhythm. Find the crack, pull the thread, uncover the truth. Then came the Baltimore file. A small coastal tech firm had filed an anonymous report. Someone using a false identity ordered radio parts in bulk, unusual frequencies, long range, military grade. Most would have filed it under hobbyist, but Ivy saw more. The name used matched an old Coil recruitment alias, Mercer, one Ivy had sketched during the lodge raid. She presented it to Crane and Monroe. "This isn't over," she said. "Someone's building a new network, not digital, analog, something untraceable." Crane leaned in. "Go on." "They're building shortwave towers, not for attack, for connection. They're rebuilding communication, off-grid." Monroe grunted. Old school, clever. Ivy tapped a map where multiple flagged orders intersected. "If I'm right, there's a relay being built right here." A remote patch of marshland. No cameras, no towers. Permission came fast. By sunrise, Ivy and a small field unit were on the ground. They found it. Half-assembled towers. Boxes of wires and coils, actual coils, symbolic and literal. A portable transmitter blinked with red lights. But no people, just a note, pinned to a wooden beam. You stopped the voice, but the echo still spreads. Ivy held the note, her jaw tight. Back at HQ, she entered it into the database. Then she flipped to a blank page in her sketchbook and drew the tower. Below it, she wrote one word: Echo. It wasn't about the original Coil anymore. It was about what remained. And Ivy knew. Their next move wouldn't be loud. It would be quiet, subtle, like a signal hidden beneath the static. And she was the only one still listening. 2 nights later, Ivy stayed late in the war room, an underground archive of old hard drives, static monitors, and half-broken equipment. She had a theory. If the signal's not digital, maybe it's being transmitted live. Using analog receivers from the Coil's own cache, she built a makeshift listening station, tuning into forgotten frequencies, AM, shortwave, scrambled bursts of static. Then, something strange, a voice, crackled, faint. "Only truth survives," The tower fell, but the whisper remains. She recorded it, played it back again and again. Every hour, a new variation came through, coded, poetic, but with intent. Shadow stirred beside her. Even he seemed to sense something. She ran the audio through decryption layers, overlaying the fragments with known coil code. The result wasn't a manifesto. It was a location, a transmitter, active, moving. Sometimes in the woods, sometimes in cities. It shifted. Someone was broadcasting the new message, not a group, a single person. Crane reviewed her findings. A survivor? No, Ivy said. A builder. Someone spreading the message, keeping it alive. Monroe leaned over the map. We've been hunting an army, but it's just one echo, one speaker. They dubbed the unknown broadcaster, the listener. And Ivy knew instinctively. It wasn't just about continuing the coil's mission. It was about reimagining it, rebranding, reinviting the next generation of believers. That night, Ivy packed her go-bag, loaded Shadow into the truck, and left DC without telling anyone. She'd traced the next ping to an abandoned town in upstate New York. Silent, since the factory collapse years ago. The listener would be there. And Ivy? She was done waiting. It was time to meet the echo in person. The town was dead. Empty storefronts, cracked pavement, power lines dangling like vines. Ivy moved quietly through the ruins of Elbridge Hollow, a ghost town abandoned long before anyone knew its name again. Shadow padded beside her, alert. Her receiver buzzed. The signal was strongest near the collapsed mill. She stepped inside. Dust, echoes, the scent of rust and old oil. At the center, a single radio tower, barely 10 feet tall, powered by a car battery and an old generator. A figure stood beside it, hooded, calm. I knew you'd come, the voice said. Ivy drew her weapon. You're the listener. The figure turned. A woman, early 20s, eyes sharp, voice steady. You took down the coil. Impressive, she said, but you never killed the belief. You're recruiting again. Number I'm reminding. She gestured at the tower. This isn't war. It's memory. Every cause leaves residue. I'm just giving it shape. Ivy lowered her gun slightly. You're not a soldier. You're a symbol. The listener smiled. Exactly. And you? You're the story they tell to keep the others afraid. The sketchbook girl who saw through the lies. They stood in silence. Then, without warning, the listener turned off the transmitter. I'm not here to fight, she said. Not today. Ivy stepped forward. Then why call me? Because I wanted to see your face. The girl who ended one movement and might start the next. Shadow growled low. The listener backed away. I'll disappear again, and you'll keep hunting. But remember this. Ideas never die. She vanished into the ruins. Ivy stood beside the silent tower, heart pounding. The coil was gone, but something new had begun, and Ivy was once again at the center of it. Back in DC, the war room was quiet. Monroe reviewed reports. Crane stared at a paused map feed. Ivy stood in front of a whiteboard, marker in hand, a blank page in her sketchbook behind her. The listener was gone, but not erased, just paused. They had her voice, her face, her path, but they didn't have her next move. Should have brought her in, Crane muttered. Ivy shook her head. She wasn't the threat, not yet. Monroe looked up. But she will be? Ivy uncapped the marker and began to draw, not a face this time, but a spiral again. Smaller, looser, a little off-center. She's not building an army, Ivy said. She's sowing doubt, making sure no one ever trusts silence again. Crane added, then maybe we do the same, but with truth. Outside, Shadow barked once, a message delivery. The envelope was thick. Inside, a new badge. Department of Homeland Insight, Senior Civilian Analyst. Ivy blinked. "You've earned it," Monroe said. She stared at the badge, then at the spiral on the board. Then, she erased it. "We can't keep chasing ghosts," she said. "We have to build something better." She pinned a new page to the wall. Not a spiral, not a face, just a circle, closed, whole, uninterrupted. And below it she wrote, "Ideas don't die, but they can evolve." Shadow lay at her feet, quiet, watching. The world hadn't been fixed. Conspiracies still grew in shadows. Echoes still hummed through static. But Ivy? She no longer chased them with fear. She faced them with clarity. Because once, a girl with a sketchbook had seen what no one else did. And now, a woman with a pen would write what came next.